Before we proceed, I'd like to thank the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, especially Executive Director Paula Marincola, for supporting this event. Culture Track resonates with the broader mission of the PCHH, to foster vibrant cultural community in Greater Philadelphia. This event is consonant with their ongoing interest in evolving audience expectations and cultural engagement, and we are very grateful for their support. A little later, we will hear from our panel discussion with Patricia Wilson-Aden of the African American Museum, Robert Blackson from Temple University's Tyler School of Art, Youngmoo Kim of the Excite Center of Drexel University, and Ryan Lewis of Opera Philadelphia. And they will be moderated by Stephanie Renee from Philadelphia's Word Radio. But first, it's my great pleasure to introduce the presenters of Culture Track, Arthur Cohen and Carla Kessler of LaPlaca Cohen. It's been my personal privilege to work with Arthur here and in Toronto and to count him as a friend. He is the CEO of LaPlaca Cohen, and Carla is a senior strategist there. Prior to working at LaPlaca Cohen, Carla worked for 6 years at the Art Institute of Chicago and is a graduate of Northwestern University. Arthur is one of our own. He's a graduate of Penn with additional degrees from Harvard and the LSE in London. We tend to overlook the last two. For us, he is Penn through and through. Carla and Arthur have worked with countless cultural organizations here and abroad, and they have a unique and deep understanding of our cultural landscape. Please join me in welcoming Carla Kessler and Arthur Cohen.
Thank you, Julian. I just have to, before we start, I don't get to present in West Philly that much, and I'm going to earn some real local cred with you guys in just a moment. But first, I want to thank Julian, who, as he said very quickly, we've known each other since before he came to Philadelphia back in Toronto, and to see how he has blossomed and the things that he's been able to do and the things he has in store here at the Penn Museum, it is deeply gratifying and wonderful to see as a friend and as a colleague. And Paula Marincola, there's kind of nowhere we go in the world where someone who asks us about what enlightened foundation philanthropy looks like that we don't point to Paula and the Pew posse. They are amazing people, and we are very grateful for their involvement. And I also want to thank my friend Tim Rubb, who's here from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as his posse. Thank you for coming. Okay, a little bit of local cred. I can't help myself. I'm going to start by telling you a story. So a couple weeks ago, we did the Culture Track presentation in Boston. Precisely when we did that was 8 a.m. on the Monday morning after the Super Bowl. You may have heard of the Super Bowl, that little thing that happened on Sunday. Yeah, that was awesome. So the presenter who introduced me said, and I'd like to introduce Arthur Cohen, who was born and raised in Philadelphia. So it was a loving group to begin with, but let's just say I could see the thermometer go down. But you know what? I own it, and I wear this really proudly. This is my home, and it is who I am. And just so you know how much it is who I am, my parents met when they were students at West Philly High. And then they moved to Mount Airy, which is where I grew up. I got to come back down here to Penn to do my undergraduate work before I kind of went out in the world. But every time I come back, I am reminded of all the great things that make this a place that everyone who is from here carries forever in their hearts. And it's amazing and wonderful to be here. And I'm so happy that Carla and I have the opportunity today to share this with you, and we're so grateful for the Penn Museum and Pew and all of you for inviting us in. So enough Philadelphia cred, let's kind of get to some stuff. So what is Culture Track? First of all, has anyone been to a Culture Track presentation before, just so I know? Okay, so relatively few people. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it started. But effectively, and I'm sorry, we don't have a screen here, so I have to keep doing this turn away, but I hope you don't view that as a sign of disrespect. I just want to keep up with you. So this is the largest study of its kind, not only in the country, but actually in the world. We know this because next month we will launch the Canadian version of Culture Track, and I believe we are doing a Scandinavian version later this year as well. So what that means is that it is the largest such research endeavor that tries to get to this issue of the hearts and minds of the cultural consumer. meaning not specific to any one organization, but broadly speaking, what are they thinking and what are they feeling? And as a tracking study, what a tracking study does is asks a similar group of people a similar set of questions at different points in time, because sometimes the greatest insights come not just from that individual answer, but how it compares to previous times we've asked. This study was fielded 8 months after the last election. The aegis, the imprimatur, whatever one wants to call it, the shadow of the election looms large over this in terms of setting a certain emotional condition or stage that I think provides a further layer of insight in understanding that culture is part of a broader, let's call it a socio-politic ecosystem. And as such, the data and the findings and the responses we got this time were unlike any we had ever seen before. So, as I said, it's a big study. It's done online with over 4,000 people this year. What we did since the previous study, which was just 3 years ago in 2014, is we asked people to critique it. Because, for example, I remember when we did a presentation at Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA in 2015, I think it was, and some people came up to me afterwards and said, you know, that's nice, but that doesn't look like LA, right? We have a very different kind of minority-majority population with very specific kind of ethnic trends and different education realities, et cetera. So we wanted to make sure that we heard that and that we responded to it by first having people critique the previous study, looking at every other study that was out there, and then we formed a panel of advisors across the country to help us kind of recalibrate. And what we wound up doing under their advice was a couple things. One is we split up the huge 4,000 plus data set into two different groups. The first group, which was the tracking group, looked like the previous study's tracking group. And the reason they look like it is because they said yes to one very specific question, which is, among the following traditionally defined definitions of culture, such as going to a museum or a theater or a dance performance, have you done at least one of these at least once in the past 12 months. So if you said yes, you got into this cohort, we called it. And previously, this was our only cohort. But here's what happened. The people who said yes, three things happened automatically. They got whiter, they got richer, and they got more educated, and therefore they looked less like America as a whole. And it was very important for us to have another cohort that looked more like the country. So we took the majority of people and we changed one key thing. Instead of saying, here is a small group of traditionally defined cultural activities, we said, what is culture to you? And we gave them a huge list of things. And if they had done any one of them in the past 12 months, they got into the study. And this is what happened. We, first of all, did it very tight. Those of you who are methodology nerds, as I am, will be very happy to see that margin of error of 1.8%. And the reason I like to kind of linger on that for a moment is that means that no number we show you can statistically vary plus or minus 1.8%. And to give you a basis of comparison, in an election year, which is something we just survived, an average Harris poll has about a 6.5% margin of error, meaning that any number can go up hugely. And this is a much tighter study because we administered it much more rigorously statistically. This is what happened with this new cohort when we created a different way of people getting in. And this is something we're super proud of. So this is US Census data on the far side of me. And next to us is this cohort culture track this year. And as you can see, it comes very, very close to mirroring the US population in a way we were never able to do before. Similarly, if we look at regional distribution closer to me and household income, this may be one of the only culture studies you'll see where the majority of people who participated live in households of less than $75,000 a year in income, because it typically is the case that for traditionally defined culture, you know, income is much higher. But here, because of the way we were able to invite different people in, we were able to mirror very, very closely the way the country looks as a whole. So this gives us all, I think, a further level of confidence that the numbers we're seeing actually do reflect what this country feels like right now. Also, generational differences. Every so often, the thing that is most interesting to us and to you is how these groups divvy up and how they behave as a generation. So we all know millennials. I just came back from South by Southwest where we presented last weekend. I've been soaking in wired millennials, 70,000 of them. So let's just say that was something. But But we all know, it says millennials 20 to 35, Gen Xers 36 to 52, baby boomers 53 to 71. But I always like to point out this last group, which we actually had to give a name to because they don't have a name. We decided to call them pre-wars. These are people age 72 plus, born up until about 1944, 1946, et cetera. So this makes me crazy. And the reason it makes me crazy, because it is true, say, of Philadelphia, of Pennsylvania, of the United States, of every Western country, actually of every major country on earth, that this is the fastest growing segment of their population. Yet it is extremely rare, for example, when we are engaged to create a strategic plan, that the discussion goes beyond millennials, and if it does, it might hit some of these other cohorts. It never hits pre-wars. And that makes me crazy. Shall I tell you why this chart made someone cry? Okay, this stupid little chart doesn't look like anything, made someone cry. And I will tell you why it made someone cry, because of this story. There are certain traits about pre-wars. One is they have more leisure time, generally more disposable income, lifelong cultural behavior, and also, this is the teary part, there are very few opportunities for them in society to have intergenerational contact, and culture space is one of them. Right? So it makes me crazy, right? I'm a really big advocate of another cultural theorist's idea of doors and rooms. And essentially what she says is we spend all of our time building different doorways, meaning this is marketing segmentation for culture. Okay, this is one segment, we're going to build a doorway for them, and they're going to have their own room. We'll do a special program for teens, we'll do a special program for millennials, et cetera. But what I believe, and I learned that stuff, like at Harvard Business School, segmentation was the core of marketing, and I actually think I'm old enough to now say that I don't believe it anymore. What I believe is that segmentation is an effective strategy for inviting people in, but what I now believe is that the best thing you can do for them once you invite them in is to invite them in to one big room, to look at cultural space as this dynamic environment where people can have all sorts of kind of intergenerational, interethnic, interdemographic mashups. And it turns out that those museums, those cultural organizations that have tried this, have had enormous success with it because we are one of the few spaces where these things can happen. So that's my little diatribe about pre-wars, other than to say they matter to us and I hope they will matter to you. So what did we see this year? A couple things just kind of overall that we think are important thematically from the last time that we did this study. Among the things that's changed is the very way we communicate with each other has been transformed. And I will say, and coming from South by Southwest, I was just living this, there is an entire generation of people who have not had an experience until it has been codified through the device on their hand, right? Until they've taken a photograph or a video and shared it primarily through social media, it has not occurred, right? So it is the validator of not only cultural experience, but almost every social experience these days in a way that it never has been before. The second, which we'll talk about a little bit briefly, is the very nature of giving. Cultural philanthropy and philanthropy writ large is transforming. And one of the things that I think we're so sensitive to, because we're doing a lot of work right now in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, and we believe that that is the canary in the philanthropy coal mine, that the things that are happening there, the way that the nature of philanthropy is completely redefining itself, is the way the country itself will soon go. And we've learned a lot from it, and we will talk to you about that. And third is that your competitors are not just the people in this room. In fact, it kind of shocks me that the people from Comcast aren't here. The people from all these non-traditional competitors, shopping centers, right? The future of shopping centers is going to be experience because retail is dead. And so we have clients that shopping center developers are coming to say, we need you to fill in these experience slots as the lure, because that's the only way we're going to get traffic into our stores. And in a new shopping center, for example, that's going up right now in Abu Dhabi, 45% of the square footage will be devoted to experience. So all of these are competitors. All of these are constantly proliferating, and we live in a dynamic world where the competition for attention is not just cultural, it is social. And it is social defined in new and proliferating ways that increase every time we do the study. So what this has led to, in 2014, we said that the very definition of culture was expanding, and that continues to be true. So for example, I know the light is kind of challenging in here, but we have this image of Hamilton in the middle that shows that even in traditional art forms such as theater, there are ways that it can be rebooted to speak and be relevant to a new audience. But we also have an image in the upper corner of street art. And one of the things that we've learned, and you may have heard this from the last study, and it's every bit as true this year, is that people who experience street art tell us they are having a cultural experience on par with going to a museum or a gallery. It's culture to them. It's real, and it's happening. And one of the things that we're particularly intrigued with is the notion of the future of cultural space. And I know the architecture world is represented today, so shout out to you guys. But the idea of what the cultural space of the future will look like is at the heart of the work that we do in the architecture world, because it's very, very much driven by these same dynamics. So let me ask, how many people can read this? This room's a little tricky in the screen. Who can't read it? Okay, if you can't read it, I'm going to I'll ask the room to indulge me for the sake of the group, for the sake of the collective. Let us all join hands and do this together, okay? But essentially what this is, it's a rank order of the top activities that are defined as culture. And what we see is, although it is fairly traditional, the top one is a historic attraction or museum, the second one is art and design. This thing happens. So the ones I just highlighted are the third and fourth, which are community festivals and street fairs, music festivals, and then a couple down, public and street art, destination food and drink experiences. So when we ask the audience what is culture to them, all of the things I just mentioned to you come higher than opera and ballet, for example, right now, because it is significant to them. And the difference is, unlike a lot of other studies we see which prescribe or predefine what a cultural experience is, when you ask the audience to define it, you get a very different set of answers. So what's it all mean? I mean, if the idea of culture is expanding and perhaps vaporizing to the point of not having any meaning at all, how do we navigate what this thing is? And the answer that we have comes up with this, is rooted in this idea of cultural utility. And by utility, it simply means what is the value or the purpose that people seek in having a cultural experience. So at the end of our study, we did a really expensive and really crazy thing, which is we asked an open-ended question, not a multiple choice one. And those of you who do research, you know that that is like crazy expensive. And the reason it's expensive is because a computer can't read it, right? It means someone has to read every answer and then decide what they mean, and in this case, aggregate them into themes. So we had someone do that for thousands of responses. What is a cultural experience to you? And it turned out, when we listened to the audience, that those responses aggregated into 4 key themes or utilities. The first one is that culture is happening when it transforms perspectives, and these are verbatim quotes. Having it change the way you think or challenging the norms. Anything that makes you feel anything and question what you already know. The second is that culture is a force for community building, which is something that I'm sure is very familiar to a number of people in this room. Building stronger communities by bringing people who may not think they have much in common together. This is the big room or the big tent. The third is that culture lives when it is a force for educating the public, broadening my horizons, understanding of life and situations, and helping me learn about other peoples of the world. This is the periscope effect, right? Culture is this way that we get to do a 360 on what's going on outside of our own world as a way of starting to understand and navigate through all the things that are happening. And then finally is an idea that is very much rooted in a lot of our practice these days, a word that you may or may not be using, but I'd encourage you to consider, which is empathy. That culture lives when it fosters empathy, bringing people of many different backgrounds together and cementing the fact that our world is better for having so many diverse cultures. It needs to bring understanding and acceptance. This is a powerful, powerful notion that I believe has always been there, but the degree, the salience of it now in this particular socio-political environment has never been greater. And I think that's something we all need to think about when we construct whatever what we call the cultural offer, the invitation to somehow engage with us. So let's look at the people who are telling us these things, the new cultural consumer. A couple key things about changing audience attitudes. The questions that we ask are really simple. What are these people thinking right now? When they engage with culture, why? And when they don't, what's keeping them away from us? So this is the chart that's gotten us in the most trouble. Thankfully, it's the most illegible today. So I'm going to read it for those who can't see it. But essentially what it says is the primary motivators, and the top one is 81% of those who responded, say that their primary motivation for participating in culture right now is having fun. So what does having fun mean right now? Let me back into it by saying some really smart people have shared some really interesting observations with us about today. Today is a moment where it is an act of courage to turn on the morning news, or read your newspaper, or go to your favorite news website. Today is a moment where we go around with a precondition, which is often, at the very least, loaded. Regardless of where we are in the political spectrum, we feel a sense of dislocation, anxiety, disconnection with those around us, a sense of not knowing where things are going, and the anxiety that that in itself triggers. So in this case, culture is this desired other place. And fun doesn't mean party. Fun just means that I first want to just not feel that, right? I need culture to make me feel something else, and then I will open myself up to all those things that we care about, the interest in the content, the novelty fact, the fact that these are both experiencing new things, learning something new. But the fourth one is feeling less stressed. Now here's the part that might make you cry a little bit about this. So this is the entire population. When we ran this for millennials, it went to number 1. And although we don't study tweens for ethical reasons, I am told that the number is even higher for tweens, right? So this is major. It means that people are not neutral. And it means that so much of the work for organizations like yours is about getting them to neutral so that when they have that moment, the artistic exchange, curtain going up on your theatrical performance, standing in front of an art object or walking into an exhibition space, you have done a lot of very concerted things to get them ready to receive, because they are not, in most cases, when they walk through your doors. So what does this mean? Well, what's your front of house experience like? Are you adding to their stress by walking in and they can't find the bathroom, or there's issues with the food service, or the guards aren't nice to them, right? That is an immediate moment of truth which will either add to the stress that they're bringing into your environment or help it dissipate, depending on what you do. So what we're saying is you guys have this thing that we call agency in that moment, that your role is not just exposing them to the cultural content, but in helping them be ready to receive. Because people are carrying around a lot of stuff these days, and we need to acknowledge that that is the emotional reality of this moment. So when it comes to addressing why culture can drive audiences away, we have a couple kind of top 4, top 5. So why don't people participate in culture? The top 5 barriers to cultural participation, starting with number 5, is they don't buy the value proposition. And we don't believe that price is ever an issue, it's always value. And if you're curious about what that means, how much was your cell phone bill this month, right? Way more than admission to any of your cultural activities because of the value proposition. That's what I pay because of the benefit I get. And unless people see that, they don't come. I couldn't find anyone to go with. This is an acknowledgement that culture in most cases, and always with millennials, by the way, is social first. And you have entire age cohorts who will not participate if they cannot find someone to go with. The next 2 are what we call these masking responses. I didn't think of it, or it's inconvenient. Has anyone complained about parking with your facility? That's this. That's the, should I say it? That's the your baby's ugly response. No one wants to say your baby's ugly, so they say this, right? This is the white noise of cultural research. You know what, dude, I'm just not into you, right? That's kind of what they're saying here. But the top one we believe very, very strongly, which is the top barrier to cultural participation in this moment in time, is that people can't see themselves there. or they can't see people like them there. If they don't find personal relevance in what you have to offer, it doesn't matter that it's great dance or great art or great music or great theater. Is it great for people like them? And are you genuine in your invitation to include them as a part of your community? Because they can sniff it out when it isn't genuine and it's not real. And if they don't see a place that represents people like them, they will simply not participate. Every so often we would come across a statistic that we weren't quite sure what to do with, and so we found it so interesting and so surprising we didn't know to even look for it. We put it in at the end of each of these sections, and we created a cute little word called Spotlight Stats, just to say, here's something you might want to think about. So under this section about the new cultural consumer, a couple quick Spotlight Stats. People with disabilities, 6 out of 10 of them, if they've had a bad experience in your venue, will not come back. No one's ever told us that before. I don't know, has anyone told you that before? So this means not like, are you inviting them in? This means if you've gone through that hugely, challenging process of successfully engaging people with disabilities and telling them to come into your space, what happens then? So 6 out of 10 of them, if they've had a bad experience, will not be back. People of color, 82%, 8 out of 10, are more likely to stay away because the activities they perceive at your organization do not reflect a range of backgrounds. The wording here is important. It doesn't mean that they are looking for you to check a box, perhaps of their particular community, but it means that if you are not celebrating the diversity that they see around them in your organization to any other community, then why would they feel invited? Why would they feel comfortable in your space? That they look at this as an indicator of welcome to them. And finally, this is a pretty shocking one for those of you who have things like permanent collections. Frequent attendees are 94% more likely to stay away if the experience is seen as unchanging. So I know one of the things that Julian is thinking about in the reboot of this space is how to make it new and fresh every time someone comes. Creating different experience paths perhaps around permanent collection objects, or mixing them with special exhibitions, or creating new activities. But what this is saying is your most loyal audience is also, in a way, your most demanding. And if you're not activating your collection in a way that makes it worth them coming back, they won't. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Carla, who's going to take you through a couple more sections, and starting with this crazy thing about digital. Carla?
Thank you, Arthur. So Arthur has just taken us through what drives people to and from cultural experiences, but what happens when they arrive? What happens when they show up at your door? How can we best engage them with that balance of both fun and purposeful? When we last fielded Culture Track in 2014, we surveyed people and only 66% of them had smartphones. So just 3 years later, that question itself has become largely irrelevant as technology gets closer and closer to our brains and bodies as I speak. It has fundamentally altered every aspect of life and how we interpret and experience the world, and culture is definitely no exception. So audiences have a range of opinions on how culture and digital should intersect, and they are relatively evenly divided on whether it enhances, detracts from, or has no effect on the experience. And this even divide is something we've seen a lot in our study. It's almost a little bit of a trendlet, because in 2017 and in 2018, there really is no one ideal type of cultural experience for any one group or individual, because audiences are, after all, the audience is made up of human people, and we have differing wants and needs that sometimes intersect and occur simultaneously. So let's begin with the top 4 reasons why audiences do prefer digital when it comes to cultural experiences. Number 4 is that it makes the activity feel new, which is a particularly important consideration when thinking about those frequent culture goers Arthur was just talking about. And this new, this interest in the new isn't necessarily shallow or some worship of shiny objects. It can reveal an interest in expanding into new ways of thinking and being that you hadn't considered before. Number 3 is deeper understanding of the content. 2, it simply makes the activity more shareable. And 1, it provides access to more detailed information. So these top 3 motivators are all about getting closer to what you have to offer and sharing that out with the wider world. And these top 3, all about connecting to each other and connecting to the content, were far more powerful than those of convenience, or even that it made the activity more relatable. Tech isn't what makes something more relatable, but rather the vessel for that deeper meaning or relevance. And here's the flip side, why audiences prefer analog. Number 4 is better connection to the content. So interestingly, this is a very similar attitude to digital audiences. 3, it's simply less complicated. 2, it lends a bit more focus to the activity. And 1, it feels more authentic. So audiences who are seeking an unmediated experience are looking to really focus in and have more simplicity in their cultural experience, whereas digital audiences are looking for a bit more connection and layers of meaning. So the insights you've just seen are audiences' responses to experiences that they've already had. We also asked audiences to imagine the future and how open they would be to digital with their culture. And as you can see, the digital appetite is fairly healthy across the various forms of culture. But I'll read out what some of these stats are in case you can't see them. We have art and design museums coming in second after tech, above even popular music or TV and film. And opera is ranking in before musicals, public parts, and plays. So remember that even though we asked audiences about the future, they'll still by and large answer questions based on their own experience, which is why opera, a more traditional art form, will come before parks. It's because the art form was really revolutionized by super titles and live in HD. And so when you think about market research in general, it is a little beyond the range of the human endeavor, perhaps, to answer survey questions about a future you haven't experienced yet. And so really, cultural organizations are left to grapple with how and if they should integrate digital technology and how that can make the experience more meaningful. So this is a moment really to reorient your digital strategies and ask some tough questions in the mirror. First, does it enrich or distract? Is the tech making the user smarter, answering their questions, connecting users to each other? Is it promoting looking with heads up and engaging with heads up rather than heads down? Does it simplify the experience or just add unnecessary complexity? And finally, does it feel authentic to your mission, overall sensibility, and how people hope to interact with you? As Arthur mentioned earlier, people can sniff a lack of authenticity a mile away. And so audiences, and definitely potential audiences, by and large will not be experts in whatever form of culture it is you have to offer, but we're all experts in whether or not your tech is informative and intuitive or clunky and seemingly unnecessary. So to focus in a bit with some of these statistically significant stats that popped up for us, who's interested in tech? Turns out it's parents. 52% of them, they are rather 52% more likely to say that wearable technology would enhance a cultural experience. And the same is true of AR, VR, and online and video gaming. Parents are, of course, interested in what they think their kids are interested in, so that is screen time. But it's also just the latest boundary-pushing technology. And important to note that this stat is not relegated to science and tech museums. It is across the board, across cultural organizations. And so if you are a parent looking for a little help in explaining a performance or scientific phenomena or Ramses to your kids, tech can help and provide that assist. And social media is even more powerful and nuanced than perhaps we might have thought. People of color are 31% more likely to say that integrating social media would enhance their experience. Similarly, people of color are 30% more likely to get cultural information from personal blogs and podcasts. So embracing forms of media that have made space for a plurality of voices in a way that traditional media has not. And for the first time since we have fielded Culture Track, since its inception in 2001, social media advertising has overtaken ads in magazines and newspapers as the #1 most influential form of advertising on cultural attendance. And that attitude, again, is even more prevalent among people of color. So if you are an organization hoping to increase your equity and diversity, so hopefully if all of you, social media should be a key part of that strategy. So the moral of this digital data is really don't throw virtual reality at your problems. Tech it's a means. It is a means and not an end. And so many organizations are hiring a chief experience officer instead of a chief technology officer, even in name alone, to indicate that they are searching for if and how tech can provide social, intellectual, emotional, and even spiritual depth in ways that nothing else can. So loyalty. Once we have engaged our audiences, how can we entice them to return and move the relationship from a one-time fling to something a little bit more long-term? You might have been staring at this slide for a moment and curious about the term revolution and whether it's too heavy-handed. But we actually do believe that it will really take a radical reorientation on behalf of cultural organizations, because loyalty is a feeling. It's not a subscription. And that feeling is all about support and affirmation and affection. And those feelings are hard-won. Like any healthy relationship, they really take time and effort, but are ultimately rewarding for all of the parties involved. So since 2011, memberships and subscriptions have either gone down or been flat. This is a phenomenon we coined as cultural promiscuity, to continue this relationship metaphor, where individual cultural participation was healthy, but not particularly concentrated in any one activity or organization. So it's sort of like a food truck mentality where people are grazing and sampling. And so in what is likely a surprise to nobody in this room, that trend has continued, with less than a quarter of culture goers holding subscriptions or memberships in the visual or performing arts. However, that doesn't mean people aren't loyal. Humanity hasn't shed this core value over the past 5 years. In fact, there are many sectors that have reimagined the practice of brand building far beyond bottom line towards relationship and community building, which is a very long-term investment. But as you can see, these industries have been rewarded. So let's take a look at the #1, restaurants and bars. At its best, hospitality is about making people feel welcome and comfortable, which is why you'll notice really skilled bartenders and servers referring to my regulars, where forming a casual relationship results in mutual feeling of ownership and belonging. The fact that in April of 2017, when we fielded this study, culture goers were more loyal to political parties than culture means that we have much to learn. And so that is why we decided to look outside of our slice of the world and culture for successful models of loyalty. So instead of asking those 20% of culture goers who still hold memberships and subscriptions why they are loyal to those organizations, we just asked everyone in the survey what they're loyal to and why. What do they care about and hold allegiance to? And outside of culture, what people see loyalty as is a personal relationship above all. And their ideal partner is trustworthy, consistent, and kind. So even before the consistent quality of your experience or product or content, people want to trust you. We're living in an age that's been described as post-truth, and so cultural organizations have the opportunity to really pick up that mantle and become beacons of trust. These top 3 motivators really do represent a fundamental recent shift from what we call a transactional model to a relationship model that is rooted in empathy, the E word, as Arthur mentioned earlier, as well as reciprocity, that it goes 2 ways, which is why discounts and rewards, which has been historically the basis of our loyalty programs, those don't even make it into the top 3 anymore. So cultural organizations that have crafted successful loyalty strategies are looking at those deeper motivators to ask questions like, well, instead of what discounts does a membership program give someone, what if it cultivated citizenship and participation in public life? And what if a subscription program really connected locals to each other and built community? So to focus in a little bit, when it comes to parents' loyalty, keep it simple. Parents are 21% more likely to join a loyalty program that simplifies their planning. The first time a young person is moved by a story, a song, a piece of art can be a profound and life-altering experience. I would venture to say that many of us are sitting in this room because of those experiences that we had with our families or a guardian, somebody who took us along. But you don't get to profound, and you definitely don't even touch life-changing if your whole family is annoyed at how chaotic and uncomfortable it is to navigate and enjoy your cultural organization. So if you succeed and simplify their planning, a family is far more likely to return. And for younger generations, to tweet is to care. Over 1/3 of them feel that engaging on social media is an act of loyalty. And the younger generations feel that engaging on social media is an equal act of loyalty to making donations. So I'll repeat that one more time for the live tweeters in the back. Millennials feel that engaging with you on social media is an equal act of loyalty. It has equal value to giving you their money. And across generations, recommending you to family and friends is seen as a far greater act of loyalty than giving you their money. And so if I tell my people about you, if I Instagram about you, I'm putting my brand and myself on the line for you, which by any definition is a legitimate act of loyalty and should really be treated that way. So here is an opportunity to rethink those metrics of success. But if we are to reimagine or expand the definition of loyalty beyond the traditionally fiscal realm, it becomes even more crucial to refine our case for support, for philanthropic support, to ensure the longevity and vitality of our organizations. And the history of philanthropy in this country is a really fascinating one. Our nation's first cultural organizations were bankrolled and run by a wealthy Gilded Age elite that were interested on the one hand in differentiating from the American masses, and on the other in rivaling Europe. And so the motivators to give really played on a rhetoric that today we see as nationalistic or elitist. Then our cities did and still do compete for resources and prestige with culture as urban regenerator, attracting both funds and very complex gentrification struggles. And then more lately, in the past 2 decades, we've moved to an outcomes-based argument rooted in utility and pragmatism, which can frankly feel impossible for culture to keep up with when competing with causes and organizations that provide basic human necessities and robust data gathering mechanisms. So all of this just leaves the development department to really not know what to do. Audiences regularly participate in culture like films or music festivals that are not soliciting additional money from them once they walk through the door. However, audiences still do give consistently to organizations that depend on donations to exist. We asked the audience what their plans were to donate, and I saw some good news here, an upward trend. But there is a lot of room to grow from 41%. And the top reasons for donating to culture, all of them relate to a single thing, and that thing is social impact. The top 3 motivators for donating to culture are belief in the mission, taking a stand in who you are and what you believe in, and demonstrating how, tangibly how, you can build a better community and a better world. So at its heart, people see cultural giving as contributing to a thriving civic fabric. We also asked why people planned not to give their money to culture. The number 1 reason, again, relates to impact. The next 2 correlate to personal relevance, and my taxes already help uncovers a fundamental misunderstanding about how cultural organizations run and are operated, which is a misunderstanding that a fifth of cultural audiences have. So here on this list, you'll see a list of all of the causes that the audience is donating to, both in and outside the cultural world. And you'll see the ones that rise to the top: children, religion, health, animal welfare, education, can all prove tangible and clear impact, or what we call effective altruism, a data-driven philanthropy that can prove lives saved or lives changed per dollar. So how can culture keep up? How can culture develop a new mode of philanthropy and cultivate that next generation of support? Well, first is establishing a dialogue-based relationship that is rooted in mutual affection, mutual generosity and affirmation. Donors, yes, want to be assured that their support is of value to the community and to the world, but they also need to feel valued. The moment that a donor feels disconnected or anonymous, that relationship is over. And next is a focus on results and impact. This always brings up the question, okay, well, how do you measure joy and tolerance and beauty and hope? How do we quantify all the things that we in this room believe make culture great? Well, knowing that social impact is the main driver means it can be prioritized, and cultural organizations will have to work harder to create and articulate that distinct impact, even if it means crafting entirely new and creative modes of measurement tools, language, and metrics to prove that culture may not directly save lives, but it can help imagine or build a world that we feel is worth living in. The new philanthropy will require looking beyond our cultural world for successful models and cases. And finally, understanding generational differences, because they have very different giving patterns. We learned in the study, for instance, that millennials are not the self-absorbed generation you might believe if you read thought pieces written by other generations. Millennials actually make up the greatest proportion of donors overall. And while they give the least amount of money, that won't always be the case, as they won't always be the lowest income earners on the chart. And what they've grown up with is an ask that is dually informal and personal. So Kickstarter, which is often reciprocal, or social, like Stephen Colbert's campaign this fall for Puerto Rico, which encouraged celebrities and then the rest of us to share awkward pubescent photos on social media, which raised over $1 million in a very short amount of time, which proves that this new philanthropy can be personal and social, and it can also have a sense of humor. So to get to some of these spotlights, For pre-wars, community comes first. They are 55% more likely to give to community organizations like cultural centers or religious organizations. So when approaching someone from that generation, it'll be important to keep community impact at the center of that ask. And culture and social change. People of color are 71% more likely to donate to civil and human rights organizations. And the younger generations give twice as much as any other generation to human rights. So the next generation of philanthropists will really require that cultural organizations actively define and create their social and civic value. So when the opportunity for civic or social engagement does arise, and of course it must also be germane to your core mission, here's an example of an opportunity to build not only relevance, but financial support. And finally, sponsorship is a business win. 58% say that they feel good about doing business with corporations that support culture. Similar to that loyalty and social media stat, this is really about living in a moment of enlightened consumerism, where people care about authenticity and they care about provenance, where their food is coming from and grown, where their products and culture are coming from. And so to align with a company or organization is really an expression of one's own values, beliefs, and personality. So with that, I will hand this back to Arthur to conclude.
How are we feeling right now? I'm always curious at this point in the presentation. Is this like happy, or do you want to go kill yourselves, right? Somewhere between the two. Before we move on from philanthropy, I need to give a shout out to some other consultants who are doing some brilliant work in this. There was a report called The Giving Code that was just funded by the Packard Foundation on the West Coast that describes the new philanthropy, and we've actually co-presented with these guys a little bit, and we learned a lot. There is essentially a further layer of evaluation and analysis that they provided to the kind of questions that we encourage you to ask about the way philanthropy is going based on the experience in the Bay Area, which we think, again, is something that we will all soon be extrapolating from. So I just want to give a shout out to them. So this is a research presentation where we don't actually care if you remember any of the research. What we want you to take away is the story, the kind of meta-narrative of all of this. So if you forget or didn't take a photograph of, and did you guys notice this little thing that we did? Every one of our slides is meant to be photographed and shared on social media. We redesigned everything this year because every time we put up a good slide, we saw everyone's cameras and phones go up. So we made sure that every page could lend itself to being shared that way. But if you didn't do that, or you don't care about that, props to you, because what we want to do is essentially reinforce 5 key ideas that we think are floating through or around everything that you've seen thus far as a way of summing up. So the 5 key takeaways are as follows. The first is that the very definition of culture is in what some people would pretentiously call a paradigm shift. It is being disrupted. Any other words I can throw in here? Redefining the very meaning of culture is a disruptor to all of your worlds, and it requires us to do a bunch of different things: to reassess the experiences and services that were offered, to remap who we define as our competitors, and to reconceptualize what the cultural space of the future might be. We have a lot of ideas about that, but we learn as much as we give in this area, because it's very interesting what visionary people are doing in this very space and thinking about what the future might look like. But I think we have the green shoots of it based on what the audience is telling us. The second is that all of us, I think, believe that for culture to work, it has to enable people to make meaning, to make or define meaning. But to be able to do that, there are roadblocks or challenges along the way. So for culture to matter, it must enable people to find or to make meaning. But at this particular socio-political moment, reducing stress, providing fun, and offering perspectives are preconditions. We need to clear the path for that meaning-making to occur, and everyone in this room has a role in that process. Third is tech, and I think the best thing we can say about tech, which Carla was saying politely, and I'll say perhaps a little less politely, is no one knows. We are in a transitional stage. I will tell you, as an observer of this stuff, I have seen more money wasted in the cultural sector around tech than in any other area because of a rush to do something. And what we're saying is, ask yourself smart questions and be rigorous, but all those questions ultimately come down to this notion, we believe, of authenticity. What is your voice? What is your voice digitally? What is your voice as an institution? And when is it best expressed through digital channels, and when is it not? Loyalty. Loyalty is now, as Carla noted, rooted in a variety of factors, words we perhaps never used before: trust, consistency, and kindness. So this is a moment where most loyalty-based relationships, someone once told me that the theater subscription model came about in the mid-1970s as a way to stabilize revenue for theaters, not as a benefit for audiences, right? It was a transactional model. And surprise, surprise, we're in a different world now, and transaction is giving way to relationship. So it's not unexpected that at a moment like this, when we have inherited models that are born of a different reality, a different relationship with audience, that they're not always making the sale. And the way ahead seems to have something to do with building a relationship that both parties find meaningful and reciprocal. And then an acronym, which if you don't know, we believe in very strongly, which is SROI. The future of cultural philanthropy will be interest-tailored and impact-driven with greater emphasis on social return on investment. So this is both great and a challenge. What it means is that the metrics must be associated with it. The people who are making money to be major philanthropists in this moment are making it in this VC venture capitalist world where they invest because they, A, want a good ride, and B, expect that over a portfolio of things they might want to experiment with, some will give them a return, and they will have a sense of what that return will be throughout. Why would they be any different when they come to you with the prospect of major philanthropy around that relationship? The only difference is the outcomes don't have to be financial. They can be number of lives touched. They can be number of social media references made, or the character of those references. All of these are in this new definition, not ROI, but SROI. The idea that what we do can be counted, it can be measured, but we have to create our own metrics because that is the expectation of a whole new generation of philanthropy. So with that, I'm about to turn it over to the panel, but a couple things I want you to know. Everything we did is online and free, including the 2,000 data tables behind this summary. And as we say, I used to think it was Gandhi, but it turns out somebody else. May 1,000 flowers bloom, meaning like take the data tables, do what you want with them. Someone came up to me at a recent presentation and showed me a millennial-only version of Culture Track, which I hadn't seen because they mine the data tables. Someone in this city showed me a membership deck built out of Culture Track findings, which I hadn't seen, and that is what its intention is. This is just a top line. These are the things that stick out to us as, wow, let's take note of that. But if you want to, everything is there and it's all free and it's all yours for the taking, in addition to this presentation and another version of it. And it's available on a variety of platforms. So with that said, we're not going to take questions yet because we need to give these